the agenda today for the coffee and conversation, or, you know, since it's 3 o'clock, it could be the cocktail and conversation. I got my mezcal, so maybe after the event I can do a little shot or different things. So, you know, it is moving towards that happy hour time frame. So instead of coffee, if you got a cocktail, go ahead and, you know, drink. If you're on the West Coast, maybe it's a little too early. But anyway, so the first thing, we'll just do a brief overview of Clayton McCurvey and why we do these events. If, you know, most of the people I think I saw on the list know us, but just in case. And then we're lucky enough to be have the Consul General from Mexico, who will talk about some of the key factors of Mexico. We'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes. He'll talk. We'll leave about 5 minutes for questions directly to him, and then he's got to leave. And then our panelist, who we have Carlos Calderon from Clayton McCurvey, who's my Mexican consulting manager. I got Gianluca Romano from MIC Software Solutions, who's going to talk a little bit on the USMCA. And then I got David Hemmings from PRA Global, which is a consulting firm. And he's going to talk a little bit how COVID-19 has been affecting, you know, the Mexican economy or the trade and everything like that. But with further ado, I'll turn it over to Carlos to introduce the Consul General, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Thank you, Tim, and thanks for sharing the mezcal after the event. The Consul General, Mr. Fernando Gonzalez Saif, has been a Consul General for 3 years already. He started and he had a master's degree at Tufts University at Boston, Massachusetts, and he has served in several positions in the Mexican Embassy at Vietnam in Hanoi. And he's gladly, I mean, he has been here for 3 years. He's an avid runner, and he's heavily involved in our state of Michigan, but also in the Great Lakes region. So we are pleased to introduce Mr. Fernando, and it's a pleasure to have you here in the panel.
Well, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I only have water. I have no mezcal, but nonetheless, I'm sure this will be a nice conversation. Thank you to Clayton McCurvey. Thank you to Tim and Carlos. And of course, this is an exciting time to talk about Mexico-U.S. economic relations in USMCA. So I will speak frankly and share some of my thoughts of what's happening at the moment. The first, and very important, in the last 2 years, we heard a lot from Washington regarding free trade in North America. We heard that NAFTA was the worst deal ever made, that job losses in the US could be blamed to NAFTA, to Mexico, then the blame was shifted to Canada and Prime Minister Trudeau, who is such a nice guy, by the way. And with a difficult background, our negotiators amazingly completed long hours and numerous rounds of complex NAFTA negotiations. 2 years approximately, it is when the negotiations started, and all negotiators in the 3 countries acknowledged that we had to update NAFTA, that we had to incorporate e-commerce, that we had to push for higher environmental standards, labor protections, harmonizing regulations, building a more efficient infrastructure in our borders, of course, strengthening the auto sector, and bringing our 25-year-old agreement into a 21st century agreement. Mexican negotiators had a principle, basic principle: do no harm and better is always possible. And basically, we approached this as a negotiation that had to be a win-win paradigm, bringing good results to America as a whole so that we could remain like the most competitive region in the world. So now with the entry into force of USMCA, what was accomplished? First, for investors, for your companies, it removed uncertainty. Also, our old NAFTA agreement was getting old. It needed an important facelift, and now includes important language on medium and size enterprises, digital trade, anti-corruption measures, and it strengthened disciplines, as I said, in labor and the environment. Second, the most contentious proposals presented at the beginning of the negotiations were eventually eliminated from the text. In the auto sector, the value chains were preserved. We avoided restrictions on the agriculture sector. And yes, we will be able to consume avocados in Michigan free of taxes. Our dispute settlement mechanism remains in place, giving certainty to investments. And the 5-year sunset clause, which was perhaps the most controversial element, was also eliminated. So yes, our NAFTA negotiators, sometimes I say they were a good soap opera, a good telenovela, with ups and downs, but it had a good ending. At the end, we did not maximize short-term politics over the long term of the economy. And we did not leave behind what we had advancing, creating in North America, as I said, the most prosperous region in the world. The final text recognizes that collaboration between the three countries is a win-win paradigm. So where are we today in terms of Mexico-US trade relations? Today, Mexico is the second largest market for US exports. Mexico is larger than the exports of the US to the UK, to France, Japan, or Germany. Today, we also agree that NAFTA was not perfect, but we cannot forget that since the treaty was ratified in 1994, US jobs linked to trade with Mexico in the US grew approximately from 700,000 to 5 million jobs. So why was NAFTA eventually preserved and improved? First, when you have the most successful trade agreement in the world, a trade agreement that has reached $1 trillion a year, you have proof that more investments and jobs will come by promoting trust in trade and investments in our region. We also learned that there was a strong movement inside the United States, led by US business, farmers, state governors, legislators, universities, and think tanks that came together to defend free trade in North America. So during the negotiations, we discovered something that is very obvious for you here in Michigan, that the US is much bigger than Washington, D.C., and that many voices in the US came to the table to advocate in favor of our free trade, particularly here in Michigan. And of course, of paramount importance was the Auto Coalition that went to Washington and said that ending free trade in North America would put US auto sector jobs at risk. Michigan raised its voice and became undoubtedly a leader. So dear friends, where are we today in terms of trade in North America? As I said, we are your second largest export market. Last year, actually, Mexico was, in 2019, its largest export, surpassing by Canada by a little. A fact that I always underline is that every time that Mexico exports, 40% of our inputs were previously imported from the United States. So each time that Mexico exports, it's beneficial for the US. Also, Mexico has become the first or the second most important export market for 26 US states. However, many do not know that even if Mexico and Michigan are not neighbors, we're not geographically linked, more than 140,000 jobs in this state depend on free trade with Mexico. Since NAFTA came into force, Michigan exports to Mexico have increased by 150%. And as an example as well, Michigan exports to Mexico are larger than all US exports to Italy, Spain, and Israel combined. Last year, we reached the impressive sum of $60 billion in Michigan-Mexico trade. In the US, only Texas and California have a higher trade with Mexico. In Michigan, in my various talks with the auto sector executives, I have been told repeatedly that Mexico, the US, and Canada don't sell and buy parts to each other. We build cars together. They are North America made. And this same principle, this same paradigm applies to other industry. Mexico, Canada, and the US do not compete against each other. We produce together and compete together against other regions of the world. So collaboration between our three North American countries is a win-win paradigm. With the entry into force of USMCA, it will create a more competitive US manufacturing environment and concurrently strengthen our region. And regarding, of course, the auto industry of utmost importance to Michigan, open markets and integrated supply chains will provide the framework for economic growth and jobs. So important now, of course, in the COVID-19 era. Under USMCA, we will have new rules of origin that increase the regional value content rule for passenger vehicles. I'm sure this will be touched in the seminar, but as you know, the new deal requires a 75% auto content to be made in North America. And the USMCA requires that 40 to 45% of auto content be made by workers earning at least $16 per hour. The treaty also includes a key chapter on labor that brings labor obligations into the core of the agreement, makes them fully enforceable, and represents the strongest provision of any trade agreement ever signed. The lifespan of USMCA, very important. We avoided the sunset clause of 5 years, and the new agreement has a lifespan of 16 years that will be revised. So why invest in Mexico? And let me share some slides with you. 1 second. I'm sorry we don't have the slides at hand, but I will highlight some important aspects. First, Mexico is a full-fledged democracy. We have changed governments in the last 3 elections from different political parties without any major conflict. We had the PRI, then the PAN, then the PRI again, and then Morena. Mexico is one of the largest economies of the world. We're presently around the 15th economy in the world. According to some projections of the World Bank, Goldman Sachs, they predict that in 20 years, Mexico will be one of the top 10 economies of the world. Mexico has great macroeconomic stability at the moment. When we revise the lifespan of the last 20 years, as you know, Mexico depended in the decade of the 80s, a lot in oil. Now we're a big manufacturing country. We are an open economy. We're one of the countries with the most free trade agreements in the world. Our demographic pyramid is composed mainly of people in their 20s and 30s. We're an advanced manufacturing country, and we are a reliable destiny and attractive destination for investment. So the quality of our labor force, and it's something that I've seen here a lot of in Michigan. More than 115,000 Mexican engineers graduate every year from Mexico. This is more than Germany, Canada, the UK, and Brazil. We are also, as I mentioned before, the second largest US top trading partner, $614 billion last year to $16 and $12 billion from Canada. And I'll highlight this and I'll share some slides later with you, but now Mexico is the 7th largest exporter in the world, the first exporter in Latin America. Mexico has ratified currently 12 free trade agreements with 48 countries that connect Mexico with 1.3 billion consumers. That's 60% of the world's GDP. So we have the Pacific Alliance Treaty with South American countries, with Chile, with Peru, with Colombia. We have one of the most modern free trade agreements with the European Union. Canada has signed one as well. And when the US retired from the TPP, the first months of the Trump administration, as you know, Mexico and Canada continued. We have a TPP-1, as we are called, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with countries in Southeast Asia. So again, connected with billions of consumers. Mexico right now, one of the biggest projects is strengthening our infrastructure. We are ranked as one of the top 30% countries with the best transport infrastructure, railroads, rail tracks, and it's one of the biggest projects of the present government that it will take a long time to explain, but this is something major that's happening in the country. As I mentioned, we're a top manufacturing production country. We're the 6th largest world producer of vehicles. These are data from 2019, and the 4th exporter worldwide. We're the 6th largest supplier in aircraft parts, the 6th largest in information technology, and the 8th largest exporter in medical devices worldwide. So this is basically the scenario, and I would say that as a conclusion, that we are destined to be partners in because of geography, destiny, and that we saw both from the impulse of the private sector and the impulse of the private society, that our countries will be united. We have to strengthen our friendship. We have to strengthen our ties. So I will leave it like that, and thank you again for the opportunity, and I hope you enjoy this coffee and mezcal session talking about Mexico and USMCA. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Fernando. So one of the things, based off of what I heard you say, that I'd like that I asked the first question before we get into a couple. You mentioned that the engineering in Mexico, and I know that the hardest thing a lot of times for the American companies here is talent. So how do American companies tap into that engineering talent in Mexico?
Thank you. Years that I've been here, I tried to make part of my job to visit companies every week, and every time I go to different companies, I see a lot of Mexican engineers, female engineers a lot. Mexico is exporting a lot, and I'm happy to see that the USMCA did preserve what we knew as our NAFTA visa, our TN visa. There's going to be a visa, and basically this will remain the same. And this will be, of course, very important to U.S. companies that can keep importing our very important talent, basically from our top engineer schools.
Okay, no, that's great. I know that there are some changes to the H-1B stuff, but with you're basically saying with the TN visas and things like that, there should be no problem being able to try to get engineers up here if need be. All right, let me look at some of these questions and see if there's anything else. I do have one of the things, we talk about the auto industry in Michigan, right? So what do you see the biggest, I know you went through a little bit, what is the biggest changes of the USMCA for the auto industry? Do you see like certain challenges or opportunities that are there?
Well, of course, the biggest change are the rules of origin. Now the biggest component from a 62.5%, we're going over 70 to 75%. But of course, there will be a transition in which we get to the 75% threshold. There's a difference between light vehicles and the different components of the car. And there are, of course, exceptions that the companies can present to the three governments in which they can give a bigger leeway to the different companies. But so this is the biggest change. And of course, the compensation for workers, that 40% of the car must be made with at least a wage of $16 per hour to workers. That of course would be directly beneficial to the US and Canada. Mexico is not paying those salaries, but this will create a bigger concept of North American made vehicles in our region. And what I see as the most important thing is that no damage was done and that the value chains were preserved. So why fix a winning game? And it's something we understand here in Detroit and Michigan very well.
Okay, great. I think you gave a great overview of what's going on in Mexico. About why Mexico means so much to to the U.S., but to Michigan in general. And I think it's a good kickoff for the rest of the conversation, and we really appreciate the time. As mentioned in the comments, the slides that you had, we'll get those out and shared. I think we just had some technical difficulties based off the size of our panel to be able to show that. But mucho gracias for everything, and I think you have to sign off, but you're welcome to stay on, and we'll continue with the panel. So thank you very much. So as we move into the next section, I did on my agenda remember or I forgot to give a little brief overview of Clayton McCurvey and thinking about the mezcal. That was the problem. I was already getting to the cocktails. So for those that don't know, right, Clayton McCurvey is a full-service CPA advisory firm that focuses on entrepreneurial, growth-driven global companies, both outbound and inbound type companies, and with a focus on Mexico, inbound, international, and just dealing with all the key aspects that a business owner would have. So being able to being able to help just get through all the major issues that you might have. If it's setting up something in Mexico, who should you get in contact with? That's why we have some of the panelists on here, such as PRA Global, that does some shelter services and some other services. And then we got Gianluca Romano, who does a lot of custom software for trade and tariffs and understanding that side of things. So that's kind of a little background of Clayton McCurvey. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, and then I'll let them kind of give a brief overview of each of them. So, we have Gianluca Romano, who's with MIC. He's MIC Custom Software. He's gonna touch on a lot of different things, but a lot related to the USMCA. Gianluca, you want to give a brief description of your guys' business and your background?
Sure, thanks, Tim. As you mentioned, we are a software company focused on importing and exporting and all of the requirements around those obligations. So as you might expect, USMCA has been a huge change for us and a huge lift and created an awful lot of work and activity. But we are active in 55 countries around the world, supporting importers and exporters as they go through their filings on a daily basis. So this is an exciting opportunity to bring some of those insights that we get from our customers to the table as to what's changed. And the Consul General gave us some good starting points, but there's significant changes in the automotive industry as it relates to the new free trade agreement that became effective July 1st of this year.
Great, thanks so much. We'll move on to our next panelist, David Hemmings from PRA Global. David, if you want to turn on your video now and kind of give a little background of PRA Global, that'd be great. I got to take you off of mute. There you go. Oh, there we go. You're off mute. There we go.
We all find ourselves talking and not speaking these days. So PRA Global, it's a worldwide business development organization, and we have a special focus on Mexico and South America. We do not do law, we do not do accounting, we do all of the other hard stuff, the identifying where the opportunities are, how you can best leverage them, and then we stand with our clients right through the process of getting them up and running, usually profitability, at which case we hand the keys of the company back to them. I had the considerable pleasure of spending a year running a division of a major manufacturer in Mexico a year and a half ago, and so I'm more than personally vested in what goes on in Mexico. I saw questions from Glenn Gerhardt regarding COVID, and I will, I think, cover all of the questions that you had, Glenn, as we move forward here. Tim, do you want me to continue now, or you want to continue with the introduction?
Yeah, no, we'll you can stay on the video feed, and Gianluca, you can as well. And then Carlos, go ahead. Carlos Calderon will be our third panelist, who's manager for our Mexican consulting practice here at Clayton McCurvey. And Carlos, go ahead and give a little background of you and you know what you do here at Clayton McCurvey.
Sure, Tim. Thank you for being part of this panel. I'm Carlos Calderon. I was born and raised in Mexico, in Monterrey, Northeast Mexico. Have been here for about seven years, close to 7 years. And I've been working with Clayton McCurvey for more than 5 years now. I focus on helping companies to expand mainly to Mexico. And once the expansion it's down there, we help with the financial reporting to make sure that they have the right information and the right inflow of information coming back. It's one of the things that we typically get asked for clients to do is like get for tax incentives, make sure that all the legal and accounting things are in place, and that's how we focus most of our time together with Timfinity as well.
Great, Carlos. So we'll just jump right in, and so I'll open this one up first to Gianluca, and then anyone else can answer it. But so with the USMCA now in effect, and you guys having to have the custom software for tariffs and different things, what are you seeing as the biggest challenges for companies trying to understand the USMCA and any new potential changes that have been out there as well?
Sure, thanks, Tim. From a very starting point, we had a question from the audience about the format of the certificate of origin under the new free trade agreement. The USTR was very positive and optimistic, stating that this was a benefit of the new free trade agreement to not have a prescribed format for the certificate of origin. To be very honest, what it's led to is confusion and duplication and of variations of certificates being requested by customers. So as a supplier, particularly in the automotive industry, one's going to see a multitude of formats from different customers with different information requested on the certificate. Some of them will be requesting for steel and aluminum content, as the Consul General inferred. Some of the customers may be requesting information on the labor value content. Also the point that the Consul General made about the $16 per hour content in your product. Many suppliers are not prepared today to generate those numbers, to determine what value in their product comes from factories that pay over $16 per hour. That's a very specific challenge, and we know that even some of the OEMs are still working out how they will request and how they will report that new requirement. So within the rules of origin, we've got major changes. We've got this labor value content. We've got the concept of steel and aluminum content within the vehicle. We've got a concept called accumulation, which has existed in the NAFTA, but not for the automotive industry under our tracing rules before. All of these can and will be requested of suppliers to the automotive industry from their customers, whether they be an OEM or a tier 1 soliciting a tier 2. So we're seeing these certificate of origin content solicitations already coming out, already being requested and escalated as the industry tries to prepare for the documentation they need to support their claims for free trade agreement. So this is a major change throughout the industry that we're seeing all the way down through the supply chain.
Yeah, okay, great. I appreciate that. I know that you and I talked a little bit briefly beforehand, and you mentioned that there's been some changes potentially that just occurred related to some of the tariffs or the codes, the harmonized codes. Can you expand on that too, which you think, you know, could have some major impact?
It's a major impact for anybody importing or exporting into Mexico. All of the classifications that you have used historically that may be in your item master for your products, for your materials, for your inputs, all of those now under the new TIJE, the new tariff, will be required to be filed at the 10-digit level rather than an 8-digit that we have historically used. So we're doing two things, two steps in one here, Tim. We're adopting the harmonized system updates of 2017 into the Mexican tariff, and we're adding a 9th and 10th statistical suffix, a 9th and 10th digit suffix to that tariff for additional breakout. And so any automotive supplier, any other industry needs to spend some time over the next 2.5 months to revisit their product catalog, their item master, their database of parts, of materials and products, and update those classifications. In some cases, it may be a one-to-one conversion or transition, which would be the easiest case. But in many cases, you'll have a one-to-many, where you have to break out your current classification into multiple classifications going forward. In some cases, it may be a change that can be done in an automated fashion, as we said, from a one-to-one. But in many cases, you're going to have somebody analyze and determine what the correct classification is. So you might have had a ball bearing that came in under a harmonized classification, as you described, Tim, that now needs to be specified based upon diameter or width or dimensions, and you have to break those classifications into 2 or 3 or 4 different suffixes. So we have that all coming into effect later on in the calendar year, in the end of the 4th quarter, and many of our Mexican customers have a lot of workload ahead of them to prepare for this change.
Well, I mean, it sounds like definitely people are going to have to do their homework and jump on this rather quickly. So we appreciate you for bringing that to our attention. And I'm sure some of the people on this live stream will definitely be going back and going, okay, now we got to change a whole lot. So appreciate that. All right, let's move on to another question, David. You know, talking about a little bit of what's going on with COVID and stuff. How are Mexican suppliers, you know, faring through this downturn? I mean, what are they doing to stay stable?
Well, the reality is that it was a fairly slow start while they tried to determine whether or not they were going to reopen the economy. However, once the decision was made to reopen the economy, then we found everybody really working hard to develop methodologies to get people safely back to work. If we just talk about COVID, first of all, in Mexico, the situation at the moment, and if you think of, for those of you that are not so familiar with the states, I'll sort of relate it to big elements, but all of Mexico that falls under California, Arizona, and New Mexico, that area is a fairly high concentration of COVID infection at the moment. And now if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of Mexico, down in the Yucatan area, that is another area of fairly significant concentration. The rest of the center of the country, everywhere from Chihuahua down to Oaxaca, is mottled and is increasing and decreasing as infection spreads around the place. And as it stands right at the moment, we're looking at numbers in the sort of 12,000 infected cases in the Nuevo León area, 13,000 up in Sonora, and as many as 65,000 in Mexico City. So there are definitely problems with the disease down there. However, It's no different from the situation that we have here in the United States. And at the moment, they have been rising at around about 6,000 cases a week countrywide. That, however, has been combated by some pretty rigorous work that was done. As I mentioned earlier, I had the pleasure of working for a year with one of the divisions of a company, an automotive company down there. And this team have done remarkably well. They have all of the staff wearing masks, wearing gloves, and wearing full face masks with a headband, with a plastic sheet in front of them. They have plastic sheeting or polyurethane sheeting between the workstations. And so far, they have had not one infection across people working in the plant itself, which is a fairly remarkable accomplishment, particularly as people are actually arriving with infections, which they have picked up from the local population, from family members, from still attending church, from going to the market, and all of the things that our Mexican brethren absolutely have to do in their life. But this has resulted in many, in fact, the vast majority of companies being fully operational. Fortunately, of course, numbers and volumes have been depressed by the reduction in requirements here in the United States. So they haven't had to work at the full-out shift rate that they were working at the back end of 2019. But some of the decisions that you need to make are, you need to determine whether the company that you want to operate with is fully operational, whether you are legally entitled to travel into Mexico, and under certain circumstances you are, even though at the moment the border is theoretically closed until the 21st. You need, I think, to check that the numbers of infections in the area you are traveling to are leveled off and hopefully reducing, showing that they are beating the trend across there. And you need to be massively careful yourself if you are going to travel there. Right at the moment, I would suggest that's probably not necessary. There are many workarounds that you can use. One of the very significant workarounds we've used in Mexico and in other countries around the world is virtual tours and virtual inspections. And to make sure that you get the best possible value out of it, what we do is we set up a person with a camera and a second cell phone, and then the master controller in a conference room in country who is controlling the video. The person who's controlling the master video in the conference room has cell phone contact to the person with the camera, and they direct them from one location to another, identifying, showing on video what it is that they want to demonstrate. Meanwhile, the person in the conference room can talk about, here's our press, that's the 2,000-ton press, here's our welding cell, here are our safety reports, here's where our PE is all being handed out, etc., etc. And while there's nothing in the world that beats hands-on being there, spending the day in somebody else's facility, I have been astounded at how well you can get an effective meeting over a 2-hour period by having it sort of sequenced, scheduled, and controlled like that. And it has not stopped any of the business that we need to do. So I'm here to tell you that Mexico is open for business. It is an incredibly hard-working workforce. They are very diligent and very focused on what they do. And where they are provided the leadership and the opportunity to succeed, they are a very successful group of people to work with.
So I got 2 follow-up thoughts from what you were saying. So are you seeing, the first one, are you seeing, you know, here in the U.S., one of the big issues is that people don't want to go back to work because it's not safe, and they make more on unemployment. Are you seeing any of that or hearing about any of that down in Mexico?
Not at all, Tim. There are some fundamental differences. Here we have massive safety nets, and some people have, if they don't have savings, they have a credit card that they can borrow against to get them through. Those safety nets do not exist in Mexico. If you're not working, you're not getting money from anywhere, and neither do you probably have access to medical facilities either. So the workforce is highly motivated to be in and working. And that's the other reason that I believe that they have been so diligent in adhering to the procedures that have been put in place in each of the facilities. So there's no lack of enthusiasm to get back to work.
So the second question on that point is, we do a lot of work with automation companies that are installing or commissioning, assembly cells or material handling systems. You mentioned a little bit about how you're doing a workaround of not having to go down there and visit. Have you seen or been able to where somebody could subcontract, somebody down in Mexico that could help do it, but you'd be able to walk them through doing the same type of thing that you're describing related to the video conferencing and the telephone and different things like that?
We have a project that we're working on at the moment that will be handled in exactly that way, where we will communicate using video cameras and capacities like this video conferencing to talk people through what needs to be done. Clearly, the people at the other end have to have sufficient training to be able to understand the instructions and be able to work directly. And another aspect that may be surprising to some of you is how many of the younger generation, and I'm talking about business people, men and women who are up to 35 years of age, who speak not just good English, but excellent English, and have a very comprehensive understanding of engineering requirements. They have the skills and they have the enthusiasm, and they're finding workarounds. So you're going to have to use a lot of initiative. You're going to have to be fairly careful. It's perfectly practical to use technology today to get around this current problem that we have, and which is probably going to be with us well into next year. So it's either sit here and do nothing, be active, and find different ways of solving the problem too.
Well, I appreciate that. So we'll come back here shortly, David. But I wanted to move on to Carlos, give him an opportunity to speak a little bit. We're talking about the economic outlook a little bit, and kind of some financial and tax recommendations that are going on during COVID. What are the projections for 2019, 2020, 2021 of Mexican sales and exports? I mean, are you seeing that there's going to be a downturn? What are you hearing from our clients and different things like that?
Yeah, so definitely, Tim, what our clients and what we continue to see is that there's definitely a declination of the market. I was just looking into the numbers of Toyota, Honda, Subaru, and Mazda. They're all down by 40% in the first 6 months compared to the prior year. The good thing is that the projections that were made in March 19 or close to that date, where all the catharsis happened, hasn't been as bad as suspected. Definitely, it's a rough time right now. But I think that after the economy was reopened in Mexico, which shows a very an act of collaboration with the U.S., because basically Mexico reopened their factories and their supply chains and everything at the same time that the U.S. So that shows a very conglomerated relationship between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. So, but yeah, for the second part of the year, the Mexican government has announced that they are thinking about a little over 5% of recession compared to last year. So definitely, it's going to be something to look at. And then you also mentioned about the recommendations that we're doing to our clients. What are the things that we are saying? What are the things that we're suggesting right now during the COVID era? During the COVID era, there are some opportunities to improve the cash flow, as we have done with a couple of our clients. So basically, there's similar to the US. In Mexico, you have to remit taxes based on an estimation. However, that estimation is based on the prior year numbers. So not necessarily, or not, your numbers of this year might not be even close. So basically, just at a very high level, what you do is that you notify the government through a write-up where you say, this year is very different to last year, so I deserve a reduction of that coefficient, and that gets you into a very different cash flow perspective. That's one of the things that we have advised to and suggested to our clients, and we're working towards that. That one thing to note on that is that there's a deadline, depending on your tax number, is that the deadline, but potentially this week you can still file and apply for that notice.
Hey, Carlos, so a follow-up to that. I mean, one of the points too that's being asked here, there's a couple of questions that kind of add on a little bit on recommendations. But the first one is, with the new sales and use tax laws in the U.S., which is kind of related to the Wayfair case, understand that their Mexican entity now has nexus in the state of Texas. Does the USMCA address any of that? So
there has been several changes on the way that they, like for Mexico, there are two main things that are affecting the Mexican tax code. One are the recommendations of the OECD, which basically this organization make recommendations to Mexico and the rest of the countries. It's not something just related to Mexico. And then the other thing that is affecting also some of the tax laws in Mexico is the USMCA, more related to the labor laws, that there were some reforms dictated by this new agreement. I don't think that the use tax is one of those things that are being addressed in the USMCA. But those other two things that are happening, they do have an impact. Like right now, in I think June 1st, it was the first time that digital companies need to pay, or you basically are withholding some of the revenue that they are getting. Because in the past, Airbnb, Uber, and Facebook, and a lot of those companies, they were not remitting any taxes to the Mexican government. So based on the OECD recommendations, there were some changes in the law that entered in force in June 1st. And due to that, there are certain withholdings that didn't exist before.
Okay, before we move on and get back to Gianluca here with the question, there's one more that I think, Carlos, you can answer. If not, we'll open this. From a Michigan law or policy perspective, is there anything that we could be doing that we are not doing to better promote business and trade with Mexico, and to give Michigan companies more opportunities in Mexico? So I think, that's probably, you can start that off, and then the rest of the panel probably can give their thoughts on it as well.
Sure, that's a great question. And as you know, last year or the year before, there was an organization called From Mexico that was terminated. So this organization used to promote a lot the Mexican investments, and with the termination of this, there was definitely a lot of us, like service providers, trying to offer different types of venues to promote Mexico, to reinforce that relationship. I think that nowadays the Mexican consulate is taking a very active role, which is very important. But I guess that one thing that we could improve is the organization of companies that do have investment in Mexico to act as a whole and keep promoting that. One of those efforts, it's going to be the Chamber of Commerce that we might be handling and being involved there. But I mean, right now, by getting this group together, I think we're pushing for that.
Any other thoughts on that, Gianluca or David?
Yeah, having created a Mexican subsidiary just over 2 years ago, one aspect that's specific to Michigan that's a benefit that could be used by your clients, Tim, is, of course, the STEP grants through the MEDC. So through the state of Michigan, we've been fortunate enough to get 50% of our travel costs on trips that are related to new business development, and sales. So even if I was going down to visit David's facility to talk to them about software or one of his customers, and I'm doing that in person, the state of Michigan has refunded us, like I said, up to 50% of the travel expenses for that business development activity. And now there's even some flexibility around virtual expenses, so updates to your website, translations into Spanish. So we found it a very helpful, very useful, and user-friendly benefit from the state to promote growth of sales and opportunities in the Mexican market.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up. I think as you mentioned, that STEP grant is we've used it before too when I've gone on trade missions or other trips down there. You know, what you're saying, the flexibility right now too, they're trying to add on opportunities from the website or other things that you're doing that you can use this because, you know, the funds are going to run out and not as many people are taking trips to do that. So I think it is, if people want to, you know, we'll put a link on the website too, out to the MEDC so you can understand it more and get a little more information. But that's a great way to get the companies together doing that.
I think that Elisa Tracy and Natalie Chamico are in this panel, so they can add to the comments into this and for people to see them and have their emails. But
David, any thoughts from you?
Yes, what we are seeing on a almost daily basis now, Tim, is that Michigan companies who are offshore in Asia, in particular in China, are looking at Mexico to reshore, not back to the US, but back to Mexico. And there's a significant number of those who are asking for analysis and interpretation and location optimization to try to calculate out whether it's beneficial. And it usually is very beneficial. The second group of people, though, are the opportunists who are moving down there to follow existing customers, to better support those customers by being co-located with them. By being co-located, they're far more collaborative, they're much more in tune with the changes that are occurring. They get involved in the whole process of sales and marketing and become sort of trusted partners who are working directly with them. And to just make the point once again, they are not moving down there just because of the labor cost element of it. Even though Mexican labor in the factory floors is very attractive, it is the rate at which they work, as well as the proximity to the markets that is drawing them down there. And the second big thing that's drawing them down there is the free trade agreements that Mexico has that they can take advantage of to export elsewhere in the world that they cannot use out of the United States any longer. And so there are numerous and very compelling reasons for taking a very serious look at Mexico as being something you should consider moving into. Reshoring and opportunism.
So really, I guess a follow-up on that a little bit. I got a question or a statement over here of, you know, I'm interested in the competitiveness in Mexico compared to the importing from China or India. Any thoughts on that? Yes, I mean, the first and most obvious differentiation is if it's exceedingly large volumes of exactly the same thing on a repetitive nature, it is very hard to beat China and its cost base, principally because materials over there are used in such large volumes that they can cut incredible deals. And that's before you even get down to whether or not there's additional support from local government or elsewhere. But the second thing is, if you are working in a just-in-time environment, then the time problems of manufacturing in China, dealing with the current financial problems of tariffs,
and then having to warehouse and manage large volume can often be largely offset by the very flexible way that you can work down in Mexico. It is quite possible to run a press or a machine for half a shift, switch out the tools, switch out the guys, switch out the material, and run the next section. And so you're only building what is necessary for the next couple of days at your customer base. And it really works well. I'm not telling you that it will be cheaper than an optimized China situation. What I'm telling you is it can be very cost competitive when you consider all of the other elements that go into a final decision as to whether you're getting value for money when you're dealing with one of your major customers.
Great, appreciate that. So moving back a little bit back to the USMCA, Gianluca, you know, you and I talked a little bit on this, you know, big thing related to the 62.5% and then moving up, and then you had the ability to opt out. What are you seeing with your big customers? Is there things that you're trying to tell people? Any thoughts related to that?
Sure, Tim. Clearly, the volume is ramped up in the automotive industry. I mean, we had become very good at complying with NAFTA over a period of 20 years, and companies knew what was necessary to be eligible for those benefits. And now we've got multiple new requirements, multiple new rules of origin, and as you point out, a higher bar to reach on even the regional value content, which was the fundamental to the NAFTA calculation. So we've seen major companies, OEMs, that are not going to be using the USMCA free trade agreement because under the passenger vehicles, they have what are called core components, which are required to be originating, such as the transmission, the engine, the steering, and suspension. And European and Asian automakers are not able to comply with those in some cases, and have essentially, to your point, Tim, opted out of the free trade agreement and will pay the rate of duty, which is currently 2.5% on product coming out of Mexico, possibly coming out of Canada into the US, rather than change their supply chains in a way that would make them compliant. So the Consul General is absolutely right that the business certainty and the continuity that the new agreement brings is very business friendly. But let's also be very realistic and say, you know, by putting in such stringent, complex, and demanding requirements on the automotive industry, in some cases, it's a business case that tells you to pay the duty, which is a surprising turn of events compared to many free trade agreements. It is very hard for a Mexican automotive assembler to comply with all of the requirements of this new free trade agreement on the automotive industry.
A follow-up to the USMCA. I got a couple of them, I think. So the first one, either maybe Carlos or you can answer, but a few people have kind of asked, you know, will USMCA create changes in the VAT treatment for imports and exports?
Yeah, I think I can take that, Romano. I don't see any changes related to VAT based on the USMCA. If you're a company that have an NYMEX program and have a VAT certification, you can still keep going using that. If you are looking into those programs, looking to file for an NYMEX and also for filing and getting the VAT and EEP certification, you can do that as well. Those options are not changing, and there's not going to be any other changes to VAT based on the USMCA, at least as of today. So,
agreed.
So, and then Gianluca, I think on this one, are Section 301 duties going to be applicable for imports in Mexico under USMCA?
So that's a really interesting question, Tim. First of all, just to back up for get everybody on the same page. Section 301 duties are what are often called the Trump anti-China or China retaliation duties. So under Section 301, we have 4 lists of products by classification, by tariff classification, that are assessed additional duties into the United States. And these lists have changed over time. There have been exceptions to them. There has been a reduction for some products of a 15% duty to 7.5%. But you can imagine the impact on an automotive company if you have goods coming from China, you've got a duty rate maybe of 5%, and now we have an additional duty of 25% under the Section 301 duties. To David's points earlier, you know, competitiveness from China, all of a sudden, if you're feeling an additional 25% duty burden on top of all the other landed cost elements that David described, that can be a very big business case to reconsidering your supply chain. So applicable for imports in Mexico. So if you are bringing product into Mexico, your US 301 duties are not directly applicable to that import into Mexico, whether it goes, as Carlos said, into an EMEX program or a fiscal deposit program or a definitive duty paid import. You're not paying those 301 duties upon importation into Mexico. Now, Mexico has its own quotas, its own duties on Chinese origin goods. Yes, they do. Those are going to be different rules, different regulations, different lists, different rates than what we have in the US. A third aspect of this that is really curious is recently we've seen cases come from CBP, from Customs and Border Protection, where it was a Michigan company the first time, where a product is assembled in Mexico of Chinese components and brought into the US and was eligible for preference under NAFTA, so complied with the NAFTA rule of origin. But in a ruling, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, said the Section 301 duties will still apply to this product. Even though under NAFTA it has Mexican origin, it will apply because the change in the assembly was overly simple assembly that did not result in substantial transformation. Substantial transformation is the concept under customs law. And so in this case, it was, I think, 3 components, electrical type of machinery, that were assembled together, tested, and then brought to the US. And upon entry into the US, you're duty-free under NAFTA is what the ruling said. So I pay no MFN duties on that product, but I'm going to pay the 25% Section 301 duty on a good assembled in Mexico of Chinese components into the US. So you unpack that question, Tim, and you've got a lot of different answers to it, a lot of different perspectives. But are Section 301 duties going away? Not anytime very soon. It seems like we've got a trade war that's going to go past November, past our elections, regardless of who wins. Are these going to impact business? Absolutely. And is Mexico a potential solution to a supply chain question? To David's points, yeah, potentially. But you've got a couple of different aspects to analyze before you have the complete answer.
I mean, I think that's a great point that you make, and the thing I take away from it always on those things is there's a lot of potential upfront planning or different things to look at and really spend some time, and don't wait till the last minute to get something done, because both in that 301 stuff, could you have done a little bit more to qualify it so you don't have the issue, you know? And then I go back to the, you know, the codes with the 8 to 10. You know, that's the same thing. There's ways probably as you get into it and spend some time up front that you can have some significant savings potentially if you do it, you know, planning up front and don't wait till the last minute. I mean, that's
absolutely. And you know, Carlos and I worked on a case where they were saying, okay, these Section 301 duties are applying to our tooling that we're manufacturing in China. What costs do I have to declare for to be considered in that duty calculation for the 301 duties? And Carlos and I talked a little bit about, okay, we have a dutiable value that's quite clear on what can be excluded and what needs to be included. If you've got inland freight in China that goes from the factory to the port, and you break that out, you can exclude that from your Section 301 duty calculation. But other aspects that might seem like a really good idea at the time are required to be in there. And you really, if you have big swings in your customs valuation right now on imports from China, you're going to draw a lot of scrutiny from CBP, which is not a good situation to be in.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. You know, we're almost, we've got about 7 minutes. So what I was thinking is I'd love to have each one of you kind of give your final thoughts, some different things of, you know, where you think everything's at, and we'll end at that. I think there may have been a couple extra questions that we'll get to and answer directly. But David, I'll start with you. Just some final thoughts.
Yeah, how about the law of unintended consequences? We have very recently been approached by a Chinese company who wants us to investigate moving them into Mexico. So exactly the problem that was being spoken about with the electrical assembly and no real mean value added to it is avoided. So you can't make laws faster than businessmen can find ways around them. And so it's really important, though, to do it properly and to understand exactly what it is that's going on. And my final statement is that Mexico is going to be an integral part of our business environment for many, many years. Take it seriously, look at it carefully. Yes, there are some things that need to be done. It's not always as safe walking around at night in the darker areas of town, but heaven knows there are places in Detroit that I don't go at night. So that's something that we're used to. But I would encourage you to take it seriously. It could be a massive contributor and a really significant multiplier to your ability to manufacture and export into other markets around the world. It doesn't matter what the politicians say, trade between countries is not going to go away.
Thank you, David. Gianluca?
I echo what David said. You know, the Consul General talked about free trade agreements with 48 countries. So we're seeing a large amount of interest in our software from companies in Mexico, not only USMCA related, but yes, the trade goes on. Mexico is exporting. I mean, you can produce in your factory a vehicle, export it to Europe, free of duties under the EU-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. You can export from Mexico to Canada. You have a choice now. You have the TPP that the Consul General spoke of, and we have the USMCA. You can export to Brazil under ACE 55. So as an export hub, the Mexican government has worked really, really diligently to create all of these lanes of opportunity. And then to add on top of it, domestic programs such as PROSEC, such as Regla Octava, where you can exempt your inputs, your materials from Mexican duty that go into the production process. It really, they've built that legislative regulatory framework to make it very attractive to build for export in Mexico. And then you talked about the engineers and the engineering, and the Consul General did. All of that is creating a lot of positive activity in the economy.
No, I 100% agree. I mean, that's the reason we continue to do these coffee and conversations on Mexico, because, you know, I mean, it's been a little bit of a slow process. There's been ups and downs because of how the economy's gone and with COVID and different things like that. But you know, Mexico's not going away. Their talent, you know, isn't going away. You know, and you know, I got a few other final thoughts, but I'll let Carlos go ahead and give his, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure. So Tim, as we always advise our clients not to take decisions, not to take long-term impact decisions with short-term restrictions or short-term kind of things. But right now, the trade war has been here for more than a year, so it's more than enough for to look to other options. And now that the USMCA is here to stay for the next 16 years, we can get into that planning phase. So now I think it's a very different situation to where we were at last year, that we were still debating if this was going to get through and when was the date of enforcement and a lot of different things that were out there. Now we have a clear panorama of where both countries heading, and that they are working together towards that plan. I guess that a few other thing is to always, when this type of deals come a reality, is good to have a good planning, to revisit to your structure, as Romano was saying, like, not even right now we're gonna look to the actual classifications, but also those items that we're already classified. Sometimes there are some savings that can be done from the customs side, and also to consider that there are a few options out there for, even though they're not tax incentives, there's still a few options for you to reduce and your taxes and be in a better cash position.
Great, I appreciate that. So you left me with 1 minute, probably less than that, just to end this. But no, I think great insight by everyone. You know, again, what I continue to take away from it is, I think long term on this stuff, there's a lot of opportunities, but it's all about the 3 Ps: planning, planning, planning. So, you know, you gotta make sure you spend the time, you know, get the right people involved. As you're you know, down there already expanding different things, you know, I'm going through a couple deals where there's Mexican entities, and there always seems to be some holdups on how certain things are being done there. So, you know, making sure you're doing things right. There's opportunities, especially now too with the COVID. You know, the foreign exchange the peso has devalued, and if you have cash or different things to potentially set up operations, you know, you now have a much bigger competitive advantage if you have a lot of contracts in US dollars and can have Mexican labor force help you with some of that. So there's opportunities. It might not be right for your type of company, but you can't not think about those opportunities. So again, I want to thank everybody that was on this, the panelists. Thanks for your time. The Consul General, we appreciate him spending some time with us. And we'll share everyone's contact information along with the slides and this link on our website at some point here in the near future. But again, thank you so much. And now it's time for me to, you know, take my shot on mezcal and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, guys.